Ted. Oh, I can't find it then. We'll sort that out.
All right, okay. All right, okay.
Yep.
Very good, thank you.
Hello and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's now 2 o'clock, so I think we'll make a start. Firstly, I'd like to welcome you to St. Peter's 275th anniversary event, which is, this is the first talk of our Heritage Week, which is going on until next Saturday. The church is going to be open between 11 and 4 every day, and we have 3 more speakers, and I think probably you've got some literature which will tell you about the other speakers. And so welcome to this event. Have a look round when we've had the talk at the photo galleries. Some of you may recognise some of the people on some of the photographs, and possibly some of them might look rather younger than they do now. Also, I must mention to you that after the talk, the coffee place will still be open in the beer house, and so please go over there, have a coffee or a tea and a piece of cake. And we will welcome you to that. So, in the meantime, I'd like you to welcome our speaker, who is Mr. John Phillips, who many of you probably know already. John is the chairman of the Formby Civic Society, and he and I have known each other for many years in various guises. But we've also researched a certain family from independent points of view, and that's where we sort of met up more recently. So please, would you welcome our speaker, who's going to give us a glimpse over time, and that is Mr. John Phillips. Thank you, John.
And thank you, Nick, and thank you for coming today, taking a chance and seeing what we can find out about Formby history. But I have to say, it was when Nick first said, would I be prepared to give a talk, I was delighted to. He said, what could you talk on? Which is not a good question to ask me. And I gave him this idea and this idea. And then I came up with the idea of what we're doing today. And that's when I realised I'd made my mistake. That was when he started biting my hand off, saying yes, and I knew I was biting off more than I probably was going to be able to chew. But we've done it. I've made a significant effort to prepare something for you today, which I think will help us all get our heads round Formby from very early times to the present day. In an hour, people have asked me, when does it finish? I think they got the impression that it's best to make an excuse to go 15 minutes early just in case I was as bad as I appeared. But no, it's an hour. How can we do it? I don't know. Did I do the research? No, I didn't. Normally, if I give a talk for the Civic Society, I do the research, and I love doing the research, and I love telling people about the research. This time, I didn't. I based what I'm telling you and what other people have already written down, because that's the best way I can possibly do it. I haven't brought examples of all the books I used, and I did use quite a few, but I've been in Formby about 20 years now, just a little bit older than 20, yeah, a bit more than 20 years. But being a historian by interest and by trade, I suppose, one of the first things I did was straight to Pritchard's to find the history books. What a pity Pritchard's has gone, but there you are. And the first books I picked up were by a local author who describes herself as not a historian. Believe me, I learnt more from those books to set me going, from those books written by Joan Rimmer, which were all about people in Formby over, let's say, within a century. And I didn't know about people in Formby. I didn't know about the type of people who came here. And I didn't know how close people were and families were and how much they mixed. I got a picture, like a smack in the face from that, about I'm in somewhere different here. And I learned from it. And then, of course, we've got other people in the Civic Society who'd written something, one of the best books, which you can't easily get. There's Joan's book, if you can still get a copy. But one of the other books is this, which was produced by the Civic Society. And people such as Fred Beardwood, whose dad was the postmaster in Formby in the First World War. And he's got a couple of his sons on the War Memorial at the top of Chapel Lane. But he wrote quite a bit of history. Bill Marshall, say, a stalwart of Holy Trinity, he wrote quite a bit in here. And this is Edith Kelly. And what you can get from this is tremendous. I always wanted to have a book about the history of Formby. That was it. It's out of print. I got this from somewhere or other, Abe Books, I think it was. But it's so well worthwhile having and reading if you ever got the chance, because there is not a history of Formby other than that one. But there were other people. For example, Barbara and Reg York, who produced a number of books, such as this one, Formby, Freshfields and Olcar in photographs. They produced a number of books as well. And so what I'm doing is I'm using all the work they did, plus so many other people. I'm going to be using this for you. The notes to me, I can see them all on the computer. I'm very clever. I can see what it says here. But what I'm saying to you is you will not see clearly everything on there. So don't be thinking, gosh, he's not got them on all the text big enough. I'm going to read it out. If it's any use to you, I will read it out to you. It's just there. If there's photographs, get what you can from them. But you get what you can is about it. And I'm going to have to go fast. It's a long journey because we're starting right over there and we're going to right to the present day. So it's going to be a long journey. Whatever I get wrong, we shouldn't notice. There's so many years from start to finish. I have got somebody in the audience whose name I won't mention, who's making notes any mistakes I make. He's going to take me out for a cup of coffee over there and tell me that'll take 2 hours. But we'll sort that out later. So let's get going. Formby, a glimpse over time. It doesn't exist that I know of. I've never heard anybody give a talk on this topic, and the nearest I've got is the book which I mentioned to you, Viking Village, and you can't even get that anymore. So let's see what we can do. The topics I'm going to go over, that's them. Don't bother reading them. That's all the things we're going to try and do in 1 hour, and I've already been talking 5 minutes. So let's not worry about that. Let's just look very quickly at some images. First image, bingo. It's Formby. It's 1956. To get the best out of a photograph like this, you need it that size in front of you on a table with some friends around talking and saying, what's that? Isn't that so-and-so? Didn't somebody live there? Whatever. That's how you use it. Looking at it from here, it's just not easy. But that is Formby in 1956. And then, I don't know if you ever remember, the Priory or the Elms, the trees, the parrot, very famous old place there. And Edith Kelly, who edited that book, Viking Village, said in 1972, If the older people of Formby could have one lost building restored to them, almost all of them would choose to see the Elms back in its old place on the corner of Elbow Lane and Browse Lane. It was a beautiful building. I never saw it. I live in Elbow Lane, but I never saw that. Pity. The Bay Horse, not as it is now, but as a very old pub. A really different, very old pub. Not the same today. And that, I know, the building, everybody says, oh, if only they could have kept the council offices. And when you say, I wish we had a little museum in Formby, oh, we could have done it at the council offices. If we could have done this, oh, we'd have done it at the council offices. Nobody wanted to see it go. But it went. And that, it's a brewery. It's the old brewery on Brewery Lane. Just a drawing. And one of the people I didn't mention before, and she actually didn't do this, but we'll see her some of her drawings, Muriel Sibley. Not a Formby person, but when she came to Formby, she never left here. And she left a whole bank of work. And this just reminds me of the sort of thing she did, though actually this is not, as far as I can see, Muriel Sibley. But there you are. And the closing of Formby Barracks, Harrington Barracks. Gosh, they're all on the shore now, aren't they? You can still see the bricks. That's 1958. You wonder why I'm going quickly. I've got a lot to talk about. And then, look at this one here. It's the, I've got to remind myself what that is now. Oh, yes, of course, the old Queen's Cinema. And I did a fair bit of work with Tony Pawson about this in World War I when it was used then. But that's the old cinema, which has a number of different incarnations. Formby Oil Well, I couldn't believe it when I moved here and somebody said, oh, we're going over the moss for a pint to the King's Arms. Drove past, he said, that's where the oil wells were. I mean, what? And of course, you all know about it, but I didn't. And I've had to put that in. It says the village chestnut trees, because every year or two or three, there's a fight about trees in Formby Village. They're so desperately important to Formby people. And if you go back in the papers, it's always been the case. There's always been problems about trying to maintain the trees. And that foundations of new houses are laid. That's building. Well, we're always building houses, and there's more and more and more. And the number of people who say, you should have seen Formby in the 50s. I wish I had done. I'd be a lot older than I am now, but I wish I had done. And that... Some shops are still here, not many of them. Derbyshire's is, and that's a half of the present Derbyshire store. That was just the tobacconist bit, and that is the guy who was running it then, whose name was Ambrose. That's his second name, not his first, because the Derbyshires, there were marriages. The Ambrose family married in, and that is, I think, so I'm told, an Ambrose outside Derbyshire's, and what a shop looked like inside. And the point being that they're all buildings that you may know about or remember, and in some cases even being in them. They're stories you know about. They're Formby recently gone. And what I'm saying to you is, recently gone? No. They're virtually today from what we're going to do. They're virtually today, because what I've got on there is a chart taking us right down the bottom. The disappearance of the ice sheets, 9,000 BC, going all the way up until we get to the time when Stonehenge was built, about 1000 BC. Don't get me on dates. I'm not going to do anything about dates here. It's all rough, so you can get an idea. And you can see... Go past World War I, go past World War II, and get up to us. You know, and that's where we are now. That Formby that you think you know is Formby in the past, it's Formby in the present as far as I'm concerned, because it's modern Formby, even if it's a few years ago. And we all, whatever we remember of it, that is a different time and place. So I'm going to just refer to that again, because if I'm going to see who was here in Formby, history is about people. We're not going to talk about woolly mammoths. We're not going to talk about ice sheets. We're talking about people. But you go back that far, and there weren't any people here. They disappear bit by bit. And one of the key things we'll all realise is there weren't many people here for thousands of years. It wasn't really until you got to the end of the 19th century, that suddenly population moved up. And you got into the 20th century and population really moved up. And that's when Formby has changed into a modern township. But for such a long time, there weren't many people about. And one of the things that I'd never be able to get in my head is, what was Formby like in medieval times? I've got an idea of what medieval times are like. I've studied medieval times. But what was Formby like? Who was here? How many of them? What did they do? What did they farm? We're going to have a look at that and see if we can work that out. I could have just come in today and given you a copy of this. Old Ordnance Survey maps, Formby, 1906, available all over the place. And at the back, you've got some notes by somebody called Jen Lewis. I'd never met Jen Lewis that I can remember. She works at Liverpool University. But every now and again, I found a beautiful piece of work for her on the internet. And this, the notes on this at the back, they're so good. She wrote them. And I might as well have turned up here at 2 o'clock, said, OK, have a look at this for 5 minutes and go and have your cup of tea. She's better than me. Brilliant work. She retired, went down the south of England. There we are. We've lost her talent. But there are still people who are able to tell us so much. And Jen Lewis said in that, Formby was a low-lying and isolated township, bounded by coastal dunes and peaty mosslands, a community of scattered farms and cottages. Yeah, I think we could all have got there. We mightn't have said it so pithily, but we could have got there. The earliest settlement may have centred on... Now, this is interesting here. This is interesting. I'm telling you this, and I'm in St. Peter's on Green Lane, and I'm not in Chapel Lane. So, how many centres of Formby are there? I know somebody in this audience who tell me, well, this is the centre. We've had a cinema here. We've got a pub or two here. Plenty of shops here. What do we need Chapel Lane for? And so this is interesting. The earliest settlement may have centred on Cross Green, Chapel Lane and School Lane, but further north, Old Town Lane could reflect occupation before the 16th century. It's always puzzled me. Why was it called Old Town Lane? I always used to think it's because it was a lane that led to the Old Town or from the Old Town. Or is it just a lane in the Old Town? And is this the Old Town? And so there's nobody who's actually written down, no, the definitive answer is, can't find that answer. So you've got to work that out yourself, what you think is the answer for that. And Formby was held in divided lordship from at least the 11th century. Basically, there was never just one lord of Formby. And we'll just understand that a bit as we move forward. But Jen Lewis then says, the parish registers from 1620 to 1780 make frequent references to, this is interesting, parish registers. One of the jobs you've got to do if you're a local historian is either go through the parish registers yourself or read what somebody else has written about them. And Jen Lewis had been through them and she mentioned fishermen, butchers, husbandmen. So farming and fishing. And from the foreshore came quantities of cockles and shrimps. There were rabbits in the dunes. Animals grazing in, as she put it, the thin soils. Cattle housed alongside farmhouses provided both milk and meat. But you're not going to go any further unless you start looking at maps. It's the wrong place. You're looking at that map, seeing what you can make of it. It's almost an impossible job. There's too much light here. You need that in front of you, like that, in a room where you can really concentrate on it. Wipe your glasses and have a good look at it. But this is the best we can do this afternoon. And if you look at that, you see 1896 Formby, and you can see a shape. And one of the things I'll be looking at later is the pathways, the roads, the directions they went in. But the shape. Formby was cut off about this time because there was no bypass. If you went to Ormskirk, there was moss. It was a difficult place to go. And one of the Formby family, a lady called Catherine Jackson, had said how her family, if they had to travel to Liverpool, which is a long way away compared to Southport, they wouldn't go to Southport. They'd go to Liverpool every time because the roads and the direction was so poor for their means of travel. So let's have a look. 1610, going back a bit more. And you've got John Speed's map. There won't necessarily be accurate detail at that time, but it's a great opportunity just to see what people knew in the 1600s, early modern times. But I'm not going to, we can't see it clearly enough for me to point out too many things. And the ancient townships of Sefton, what were they? And we've got Formby there, known early on for the church which is now today, St. Luke's, except it wasn't St. Luke's, it was St. Peter's originally, and it was down in the dunes, which tells us something itself, because that's possibly where the original largest area of population was, down there. Fishermen as much as anything else. But if you look on there, you can see Argylls, which is gone. Ainsdale, which was linked with Formby for many, many years until eventually they split. And you can see Ravenmills. And Ravenmills, a lot of that was lost, as we'll see. I'm going to mention that in a moment. I'm not going to go into that one. That's Jen Lewis's plan of historical settlement here. We're going to start off and go down to see what's the first examples of habitation we can find. I'm not going to do any testing of you on Mesolithic and Neolithic. That's not my strength, and we won't have time to. It's not the important thing. The important thing is that distance of time you can see there, the thousands of years. It's the distance of time before people start coming here. And who were they and what did they do? What evidence have we got? History is about people. People write and they leave records. We read the records. Whatever the record is, we read the records. And that tells us what happened in the past. We can also use other evidence. So we look at artifacts and we try and date the artifacts as much as we can. We try and work out what the artifacts were used for. And if they were used for that, why did they use the particular one we found? Were there any alternative choices? So it's the historian. He's reading all the written words and he's also looking at the artifacts. And we've got some good indirect evidence for settlement, prehistoric, before written records, and that is a human footprint. And we know about the human footprints here, which were really discovered and developed at just the end of the last century. Gordon Roberts, a languages teacher from Formby High, was the guy who really set that in motion. Human footprints and animal trails on the beach at Formby, dating from the late Neolithic to the early Bronze Age. Late Neolithic. Look at 4,000 years before Christ, 3,000 years, and going up to the early Bronze Age, 1,000. So in that period of time, eventually, you've got some signs that there were a very small number of people here because their footprints have been left on the beach. And you can also realize that there was some form of habitation around there. Not many, depending on the fish, depending on whatever was about them, the birds and animals. They weren't farming, but they were going to start farming. They would soon. They used flint tools. Lunt Meadows, they found a trove of flint tools, and they'd possibly move around. They wouldn't stay in one place, they'd move around, but then they'd probably leave their flint tools, go away somewhere else, and then come back and use them when they needed to, when they returned to that spot. So they found dugout canoes. I'll tell you now, I love a good fellow who's a good woodworker, somebody who can really work well with wood and make a canoe. How you make a dugout canoe, it seems a very hard job, and they've actually found a couple of old examples of them. So old, but they were uncovered up at Martin Mere. Recent excavations at Lund have provided evidence for settlement, radiocarbon dated to 5,800 BC. We'll never get home for tea at this rate. We'll have to move faster. There's the print of a red deer stag on the shore at Formby. That's 6,000 years BC. Wow. It's very, very difficult to comprehend that you could walk out the shore and be walking straight over where that was discovered by Gordon Roberts and photographed. Come on, do it for me. And human footprints between 3,000 and 6,000 BC. Human footprints on the shore here at Formby. And it's a staggeringly exciting discovery that was. I'm not going to bother with this because that's a map showing where all these particular creatures' footprints were found. And it mentions Gypsy Wood, the Cornerstone Park. You know, you go to the bottom of Victoria Road where the National Trust is and just turn on the right and there's the Cornerstone Trail. And if you just go off there, there's a number of findings there. Tracks of red deer, roe deer, human trails. But again, move on. We're getting up to an area I know a bit more about, the conquest. Anything after the conquest, I've got a good chance in being able to give you an answer to a question. Before that, I'm not so sure. But pre-conquest, who conquered us before the Normans came over? Well, the earliest place names we've got that are older than Viking place names are Celtic. And the river that runs just south of the Alt, that's a Celtic word. So there were people here to give it that name. And also Ince, we're travelling through the main road from Crosby to Formby, and you come through Ince, through the woods. Ince means island, and it's Anglo-Saxon. So if you're coming to names like that, you know there were people who were about, but there's very few remains. You don't find many Anglo-Saxon remains. You don't find any Roman remains. There was a Roman coin found, but it was found in that house we mentioned before, the Elms. Somebody had already got a Roman coin and had taken it there, and somehow or other it had stayed there, but the Romans didn't come through here. And that tells us something else about Formby. It was off the beaten track. People didn't come to Formby particularly, unless, going back in time, they found that the area was what they wanted in terms of hunting and gathering. But we were off the beaten track for the main invasions until the Norsemen. So we know that about 650 AD, the Anglo-Saxons reached the northwest and settled areas, and we know this because of their names. We know who settled the places because of the language. And so if you say Sefton, it's an Anglo-Saxon name. If you say Melling, or Thornton, or Orton, they're Anglo-Saxon. We know that because of the name, not because of huge finds which have told us, oh, look, Anglo-Saxon people were here. It's because of the name. And then from about 900 AD, saw the beginning of the Norse raids. Be careful, we got one of them here. But fortunately, she's not got a sword with her, have you? And then settlements on the coast. I remember when I first came here, I was thinking, well, the Vikings came to Formby. Everybody knows that. Viking Village, everybody knows it. I remember standing on a sandy and overlooking the river and thinking, oh, the Vikings, did they come up the river this way? How did they get here? And of course, a lot of the raids came on the east coast. But apparently, the Danes did not come from east to west overland. But they did go over the tip of Scotland and into Ireland and the Isle of Man and settle there because they were looking for settlements themselves. They've got the reputation of attacking, plundering, but they actually settled there a lot. And then when they did settle, they had to keep that settlement. And some of them had to leave Ireland and leave the Isle of Man. And so they came towards our coast looking for a new place to settle. And then, did they come up to Formby shore, park their boats and start running in, chasing all the fishermen from Formby away? No, that probably wasn't what happened. What's likely, and I know this because I've asked so many people, everybody says, well, we don't know, but they're likely to come up the Alt. That's the likely thing. They came up the Alt and settled, and didn't settle down by the shore, but settled because they were probably already down there. And they probably settled up here, but we know again that the Vikings were here, not because we found helmets or remains of boats or burial sites. There's no Sutton Hoo here for kings who've died and been put to sleep in a boat and then covered over. We don't have anything like that. It's the name. The name of the place tells us about this being a Viking spot. So they wanted to occupy vacant areas. That's what they looked for. And the names, just look at some of those names. A BYR, a homestead. And Formby, it could either mean Old Town or Formney's Town. Most people tend to think it means Forney's Town. But that is one name. And if you look at others that are Norse names, you've got places like Ainsdale, Birkdale, Argymeels, Scaresbrick, Ormskirk, Burskow, Skelmersdale, Crosby, and I've got a lot of names written on there. We know that they... Pardon?
Ainsdale's actually, Angelos was a Viking chieftain, and Darla in Viking is a Vale of land. So Angus Darla, they settled in Ainsdale.
Right, I didn't know that. Yeah. So that's them coming here, and you've got this funny little map you've got up there. And no, you will do in a second. It's the next one. And if you look at that, you might think he's put that up because of Formby Church. St. Peter's is up there on the top left. No, I'm only showing you where Formby Church is because I want you to go to the other side of the map, and I want you to look going down past Shawlockers, the farmhouse and Shawlockers Lane, and then you see a lane going down. And one or two of you might live there, Deansgate Lane, but it doesn't say it. Because at the end of the 19th century, when that map was produced, it was Danesgate Lane. And a lot of people have taken that to mean the Danes were up that way, that they settled, they came down the Alt. They might have gone down, because the Alt has moved course significantly over time, a number of times, and that they were up past here, not down by the shore. But listen, I'm taking too much time on this. Key time, 1086, Doomsday Book. The country settled, but descendants of Vikings in Normandy, led by their Duke William the Conqueror, come over to take the country which he believes he's been promised by a previous king of England. So he comes over, brings his army, defeats Harold, and the rest, as they say, is history. When he came over, he gave land, this is William the Conqueror, he gave land to the people who'd come over to support him. And he started off by the most powerful supporters. And so to each of those most powerful supporters, he gave a lot of land. More than they needed. That was their reward. But then, of course, they had their followers. So each one of those would be going down a bit and saying, you can have this, you can have this, you can have this, you can have this. And the country was divided out as such. What William said to everybody he gave land to was, it's my land. You own it from me. I need your support or service. You send X number of people and provide that service. And that was the agreement. And the same thing for the next one down. I'm giving you this land. I need anything to help the Duke. You're going to send your men to me. And when it got down to people who lived in the areas, they had no rights whatsoever. It's your do as you're told. And whatever I require, if it's building something like a small earth and wood castle, you're the one who's going to be digging the earth, creating the moat, cutting down the trees and making the castle, because you are now working for me under the manorial system or the feudal system. That's what you're going to be doing. And over time, it became put into law that if you owned a piece of land from the Lord, then sometime each year you had to do certain jobs for him. That's the way it developed. But this is very important. The Doomsday Book, which came 20 years after the Battle of Hastings, it showed what land was owned by whom right across the country. And in Formby, it showed that the land had previously been owned by 3 Anglo-Saxon lords. And the word they used for them was a thane, T-H-E-G-N. I know you'll know it, but 3 thanes there were. And each of them owned a certain portion of land. One was Formby, one was Raven Mills, but which would be eaten into so much by the sea, so it disappeared a great deal. And the other one was Ainsdale. And it's likely that those areas of land owned by those 3 thanes, they would have been passed on to 3 Norman supporters and continue to be used as landowning measurements for hundreds and hundreds of years. Whatever was down in the Doomsday Book, names may have changed, but the idea remained the same. I'm just wondering how much I need to tell you of this. A lot of it you would know yourself from your history books and from your history lessons, but there was a chapel, Formby Parochial Chapel. We always talk about St. Luke's. That's where it was. And to me, the key thing about where it was it wasn't far from the shore. And you're not going to get a chapel being constructed and running for the length of time it was, unless there's a population down there. Roads were absolutely appalling. All right, the population wouldn't have been so great, but you're not going to get that without having a community down there. And it could easily be that was probably the biggest community for hundreds of years down there. And if it was down by the shore, if you're going to have any use of the shoreline, some people would certainly have been down there with whatever boats they had. Whatever they did, they would have been down there. Some people think there might have been a natural harbour down there. If you go into Liverpool and you see, well, it's right by John Lewis's store now, but the first dock of Liverpool, built in the early 18th century by Jesse Steers, that dock was actually created on land known as Liverpool Haven or Liverpool Harbour. It was just a cut-in, a natural cut-in away from the main waterline, but it sheltered ships. Same thing in Formby. There was probably down there somewhere which could have sheltered ships. Nobody can prove anything of this. I've looked and looked and looked, but most people think fishing was important. It's likely there was some form of shipping, boats down there, small ones, used by small fishermen, but that's probably what there was. It would have served a small community, and it lasted until 1739. I've always felt that the Formby family were probably fairly happy that it blew down, because they didn't live anywhere near St Luke's when they moved to Formby Hall. We'll mention Formby Hall very briefly soon. But they had to travel down to church every Sunday in their car, in their horse and cart. And it was a very, very difficult drive down. So if they had a chance of building a new church and coming here, it was a far better place for them to come to. So at some point, 1739, that ended that church. And as you'll know better than me, so many things were brought up here, and this church was built. Now, we'll mention this church later. So there were accounts, which shows it was quite a going concern if there are accounts, and we've still got copies of the accounts that we can look at. So accounts for 1705 to 1730, we know it was a small rectangular building. It probably measured about 15 foot wide and 30 foot long. They put lime on the walls to make it look, give it a white aspect. Small tower, probably a bell. An hourglass was in there for servants. There's a communion table, Laudian rails to keep the dogs away in case they came in during the service, etc. So there's quite a few things, and of course they also had down there the Godstone, which nobody quite can work out exactly what it was, but that was down there as well, which dates it to many hundreds of years previously. The name of the landowners changed, bits and pieces. The main landowner was probably, for the whole area, was the Earl of Derby, who then gave his land to plots to other people. The first person to take the name of Formby wasn't born with the name Formby. He took the name Formby from the village, and his name was, he called himself Adam of Formby. 1334. Adam of Formby, 1334. And from then on, we have Formbys here. And there's always been a Formby here. Not usually the main landowner. Other people have held more land, but there's always been a Formby here. In the 1550s, for example, the Formbys owned a quarter of Formby, but the Halsall family, 3/4. Formby Hall was built in the 1400s. So things changed, things developed, and that's how the Formby families were here, bit by bit. You actually could follow these lines. There's a history of Lancashire, the Victoria County history of Lancashire. It was written over 100 years ago, but you could still pick it up on the internet. It'll send you to sleep, unless you're really dead keen on finding out who owned which piece of land and when they took it in. But nevertheless, that's something that you could do to get more. Formby wasn't run like, if you remember those dreadful lessons given by awful history teachers talking about the three-field system. So they used to have fields for different crops, and then a fallow field, which would give it a chance to get itself back again to active service, if you like. It wasn't quite the same up here, but the village was divided up into strips, and it was still like that into the mid and late 19th century. So the Formby fields were the fields belonging to people, most of them owned by wealthy families, but still other people had them as well, or had use of them. So I think that's probably 150, 200 years after the Norman conquest, you probably got that system settling down, and it lasted an awful long time. Things didn't change much in Formby from what I can see. And the reason they didn't is quite simple: small population. There's nothing much going to happen if you've got a small population. So that's a map of the Formby town fields from 1845 tithe map. Again, you can't see it clearly, but the village was divided into these strips of land. And the manorial system was there for hundreds of years. People were still in the 18th century doing what they called boon work. Boon work meant doing something free for the main landowner. So the guy who owned the land says, I want you to go and do a job for me every particular month. You did it because you got the land from him and you owed that boon work, free work. In 1737, for example, the rent of one house standing on 1 acre of land, Richard Sutton paid 13 and sixpence plus 1 day digging of turf and 1 day reaping of corn. And in 1739, William Lovelady, real Formby name that, William Lovelady, I'll mention it later, a fisherman had to do 1 day of shearing in a time of harvest and give 1 day to the Lord at Christmas. So 2 days a year he gave to the Lord. He didn't get paid for it, he just had to give those 2 days. Agriculture, I'm going to go through this awfully quickly because time is it. I'm just going to go through it awfully quickly. But Catherine Jackson, who is a member of the Formby family, said, arable cultivation was the prevailing rule. The land did not fatten cattle. So you get an idea here of the importance of arable. And wheat, until the 18th century, wheat wasn't really grown because of flooding. It didn't, the wheat didn't like the badly drained lands. But eventually they did improve it. They did drain the lands. There was an act in 1779, the Alt Drainage Act, and so wheat, rye and potatoes became the favourite crops. So agriculture changed over time. Not much barley, not much oats, but they did use some malt for brewing or distilling. And Formby is quite well known in the 19th century, early 20th century, for the number of breweries and the quality of beer it produced. Potatoes, there's a favourite story that potatoes were brought over to this country by Walter Raleigh, and Formby was the first place for it. But there we are. There's no evidence that that's the truth. They were introduced probably 1650-ish, but they really took a while to settle in. And then they found they could grow potatoes here, and they sold them mostly in Liverpool. The best fertiliser was dung, of course, and the fellow who capitalised on that was Thomas Fresh, who realised that by bringing the dung of Liverpool people overnight on the trains and taking it off at Freshfields and spreading it on the fields, improved the quality of the potatoes enormously and made himself a lot of money. Hence Freshfield. And turnips, eventually, when potatoes improved, you got turnips as well. I'm not going to bother too much about market garden crops. Asparagus was long established, and it was only really since the war, I think, early 20th century, Jimmy Lowe, the famous asparagus king, very famous for asparagus, but then, bit by bit, we've lost our asparagus farms. There's very little left now. There's possibly one, I think, left, isn't there? Rux's farm. But that had been there. Cattle farming, we know, I've talked about this. People kept sheep, less than cattle. Most families would keep a pig, just one, and of course horses needed for different work. You find around the place pounds or pinfolds across Formby, and stray animals would be impounded and put in the pinfold, and people called pindars were employed to make sure that the cattle were well kept and returned to their owners. If you look at any maps of Formby, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, there's wells all over the place. And so that's how people got their water, particularly. I'm thinking of coastal change. The sand dunes have been there a considerable time, but I'm not going to talk about the history of sand dunes, but they have been there for some time. And one of the things that's always memorable about the sand dunes is the madam grass, or it was called star grass or star, and it was so important. So you could keep the it had long roots and tough roots, would hold the sand together and keep the sand dunes. People were told every day of the week, you're responsible for getting out there and making sure nobody steals our stargrass, because the Formby people knew that the madam grass made great brushes for them to use in their yards or whatever, and they made great mats, lovely mats, and so Formby people would rather rip the stuff out than make sure it wasn't ripped out. But unfortunately, the star was something which was very important to people, especially in the 17th, 18th centuries. Lots of rabbits, still rabbits down there, but they were introduced as a means of food. But you had to have the permission to keep rabbits. You couldn't just go out and kill a rabbit and eat it. That was not right. You had to have your area, and you know where your rabbits were, and they were the ones you could take. And for example, they were called conies at the time. After an agreement in 1667, a tenant was allowed to take and kill by any lawful means the rabbits and the conies, but only on the section he rented. Neither could kill or capture conies with nets, dogs, ferrets within another person's share. The alt's important, but it's difficult to work out where it was. We know where it is now, but it's moved around so much. And I think that from what I've read, it must have been closer to the centre of the village. I think, reading from other people, that it was much closer to the centre of the village. And I think it was a lot nearer down to where Cheapside is too. Because Cheapside is an Anglo-Saxon term for a market area. Why should you have a market area there? And also, apparently, there was a ford, an ancient river crossing place down at Cheapside. And yet, why say that when the river's so far away? And the answer is because the river wasn't actually far away then. And lots of the paths through the village went to the Alt. People wanted to either cross it or travel along it. So it's an important thing to remember, that the Alt has probably changed a number of times in where it is, and that's changed how the roads in Formby have grown and developed. I'm not going to go into woodlands. We know there's lots of trees. They've been grown particularly to protect farming areas by the Blundells or the Formby families, but on. And as for fishing, fishing was part of the Formby economy, and there would have been a place for boats to come and go, but there's no sign, there's no evidence there was a quay there. In the 15th or 16th century, people had to be granted the right to fish. Leases used to include the right to fish on a given part of the shore. And that part of the shore was called a stall, S-T-A-L-L, and you had to pay tax for that, which was called stallage. So, yes, or stallage, no doubt. So fishing was important, but we don't know too much other than it was organised. A lot of people would fish, and it was organised, but there was not, that we know of, any particular quay there. If you had a boat, you'd pull it up on the shore and tie it somewhere then. There's something called the Lost Settlements of Raven Mills. We can learn an awful lot about what life was like in the 17th century, the 16th century, and the 15th century from going at wills and looking at inventories, which they actually are kept in Preston at the Record Office. But there's a number of people in the Civic Society about 10 years ago who went through them and came up with quite a bit of information about how people lived in Formby. And here's, for example, John Sutton's will, 1728. How do we know about John Sutton and how he lived? It's because this is time when people did leave written records. So, item, I give to my wife all my land in Scarisbrick and the house wherein I live, and the chamber and the buttery and the chamber above stairs, enduring her life, provided she remain my widow. But if it happened that she marry, then it is my express will that immediately after her marriage to her decease, I give all my land and my house to my only son and heir Richard. Now, I've galloped through that. The idea being you'd go through that and you could recreate the circumstances in which he lived and the kind of place in which he lived. John Sutton, I give the whole profits of my tenement immediately after my decease to be equally divided amongst my 4 children, so long as they all remain unmarried. Choice of my mares and my best saddle and bridle and a large brass pot and a mortar and a pestle and all my apparel. Item I give to my 3 daughters, each one of them the full sum of £35 to be raised out of my monies and goods, and so on. So from that we can find out how people lived in Formby. And then there's also something was found in the 19th century in this church in an old chest called the Formby 15 book. And it contained a list of Formby people of that year who had enough money to pay a particular tax at that time, which was called the 15th. The list contained the name Rimmer 38 times. No surprise there, even if they did spell it slightly differently in those days. There were also 17 Norrises, 10 Suttons, 8 Browns, 7 Formbys, and 6 Aindos. Again, no surprise there with some of those names. But that's interesting, going back that length of time to 1679, to see those names had all followed through. And if they were there in 1679, they'd have been there a lot earlier as well. And the other names that mentioned are Blevin, Ambrose, Dobbs Gutter, of course, Gore, Gore's Lane, of course, Jump, Shawlicker, Shawlicker's Lane, Tyra, Wright, etc. So those names have got some history with them. And the cottages, whitewashed thatched cottages, were plentiful. They're the sort of thing there were so many of in the 19th century, fewer today, but hopefully more protected than they might have been in the past. Mills are no longer left, but there would have been a number of windmills and water mills, but mostly windmills, and Cable Street and Old Mill Lane are the places where most of them were. I think there was one in Chapel Lane. Not going to stop. Market and Fair, if you go to Cross Green, yes, Cross Green was the centre in probably the 17th, 18th centuries for sales weekly and longer than that. There was every week there would have been some form of market held on Cross Green, and there was an annual fair held on 29th of June. They would sell animals as well as goods, and local people would have other choices to go to. But people still must have been attracted to come here by that. I'm not going to do port. And a dangerous coast, not going to do that. Lanes and pathways through Formby all depended upon where you were going from and where you're going to. Sounds obvious, doesn't it? Where are you going from? Where are you going to? Well, you can start off with churches, because churches are going to be built by communities of people. So people are going to visit other people. They're going to go and buy things from them. They're going to see them. They're going to do work for them or whatever. And churches is a natural thing. But add into that the Alt. Wherever the Alt was, people would have lanes and pathways to get to the River Alt because it was an important inland communication centre. If you think what roads might have been like in Formby, if you go back 100 years, the word dreadful springs to mind. Sand, and in bad weather, muddy sand. Oh, it would have been awful. So, were there any centres of population? Well, we've gone through what we thought were the centres of population, and moving on from that. That map there, 1848, if you look at it, I've put in yellow some of the possible pathways there were. Going from the shoreline into the centre is an obvious route. But there's other things. So, for example, if you were to start at St Luke's and walk into the centre of Formby, on the way there was what's called a cop cross. In other words, people would stop off with a funeral and then they'd pause there because they were carrying the coffin or carrying the body or whatever the body was encased in. But that's the sort of thing you could find on one of these main routes. I think also you'd find routes going up to Cheapside and the crossings of the Alt and down Holland Brook. It's difficult to work out exactly where all these lanes were, but there was a reason. They grew up because there was a reason. They were going somewhere and they were coming from somewhere. And then in 1848 I've got this map showing the centre of an area around by Cross Green, and that's where the lockup was. So just the top of Phillips Lane was an area where they had I can't even say jail, but a lockup. And they had the stocks there as well. The stocks were there for hundreds of years, right by the town green. So that must have been seen as quite an important area to have those items there. And I'll put you there, the Cop Cross. Again, you can't see it so clearly, but the top map up there, if you see the station on the right and you walk along, eventually you come to some fancier writing, and that is where the Cop Cross was. So anybody travelling down for a burial at St Luke's, they'd stop off there. And apparently they think that the Godstone had something to do with the burial service, so that you had to do some kind of activity around the Godstone when you got to St Luke's. But there you are, that's something you can read up yourself. It's got different opinions about it. But if you have a look there, you've got you've told me, Nick. That's where the Cop Cross is on this bigger map. So you come in from Formby Station, there's the Cop Cross. Then you come down here and down Old Church House. That's St Luke's, more or less. So that's one of the things that you're looking for when you're trying to work out how the roads developed. And Cheapside, how did Cheapside come about? Well, if you go down, here's the Bridewell and the stocks. And then you come down here. If you go down this way, you're going all the way down to the shore, Ravenwell's Lane. And if you're coming here, somewhere around here, I believe that you'll find the river would done something there. The river would have been there, and that's where it would have been a ford. And Catherine Jackson, when she was talking about the road, I've got to read this, but it's St Peter's. I know we're running out of time here. Roads were very poor for many years. A good example coming from the book you've got on the back there, the lovely book by Neville Carrick. And he mentions the consecration of St Peter's in 1747. The service was to be conducted by the Bishop of Chester, who would have had to travel to Formby by coach in winter. An arduous journey. So they waited until July and better weather. And this gave time for improvements to be made to the local roads. And in Olca, for example, 1 shilling was spent on repairs. It was so poor, the road, they had to tell you that. But 1 shilling, well, so some time ago. And Catherine Jackson talks in her book, I've got a copy of it, Formby Reminiscences, published just the end of the 19th century. Very interesting and illuminating book. Catherine Jackson talks of the drive to church, St Peter's, in the old yellow family coach of those days, ploughing at foot pace, steadily through the deep sand and heaving from side to side with the rolling motion of a vessel at sea. I have a keen recollection of the early discomforts of those old, deep-rutted sand roads, and before the invention of the two-wheeled carriage, a man was employed during the week to smooth the way to church for the family coach by filling the deeper ruts with sods from the raised part and thus levelling the surface in some measure. Formby roads, that was the end of the 19th century. It took some time before we got proper roads in Formby, etc., etc. And there's a picture, that is just, which one's that? That's Green Lane, that is, believe it or not. Green Lane, and that is the 1920s. The 1920s, Green Lane. And you can see that we've travelled a long way, but it's still a very small and rural area. And that one, Piercefield Road. And can you see that bit on the right, which is empty? Empty space. Nobody's built a new house there and said, oh God, I'm going to... That space on the right, that is the embassy. It hasn't been built there. But that is where the embassy is now, just on the right there, at the top of Piercefield Road. But just look at it. That is the sort of road that people would have to deal with. I'm not going to talk about religion because we're running out of time. I just want to, I think you all got a good idea of the development of churches and the very, very important part this particular church has played in the early modern history of Formby. But the growth of the railway is what changed things. It wasn't just this part of the world, it was the whole country. The whole country was growing, and in 1848 we had the first station built at Formby, and then 54 Thomas Fresh managed to talk a new station which was eventually called Freshfield. In 1851 the population of Formby and Ainsdale together was 1,594. By 1901 it was 5,642, which doesn't look like a lot, but in comparison, imagine, that's 1,594. 100 years before that, it wouldn't have been 1,000 people in Formby. But this, by 1901, by 1914, the beginning of the First World War, it was 6,000. So it was the same, population growth was the same right across Sefton. The railways did it. And then in Formby, in 1901, 5,642. It went up by another 300 or 400 in the next 10 years, and then another 400 or so in the next 10 years, and then it's got up a lot since the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. And of course, the big thing was the house building boom, if you want to say that, in the 1960s, which brought an awful lot of people to Formby and changed the face of the place altogether. I'm not going to look at that in detail because we haven't got time. But the things that have been brought to Formby, sorry, were you interested in that one? Water, sewage and drainage. Things had to change. In 94, Formby was a parish council within West Lancashire. And then there was a campaign. A lot of people were coming here because of the railway, and they wanted to change. They wanted new roads. They wanted lighting. They wanted lots of things which ordinary people who'd lived here for so long didn't care about. They liked Formby as it was, and we're all the same still today, aren't we? Every time you walk down Chapel Lane, what's that shop? They should shut that shop down. What's that? What are they calling it? Etc., etc. What's that music from that one? I'm the same as you, by the way. Any shop you don't like on Chapel Lane, I don't like it either. The best one is... Oh, no, I better not tell you what the best one is. It was a change, and there had to be a vote then to decide, are we going to become an urban district council or not? Not a rural one, an urban district council. And after a terrible campaign, the vote was 385 for and 365 against, with a load of abstentions. But eventually, with the help of the Formby Times, which had been introduced to help the campaign for, then it became an urban district council. And then it was helping change come along. Sewage was the biggest problem. Sewage, because you couldn't put the pipes under the ground, they'd put them under the ground, think you'd done it, crash, have to do it again. And they were doing it along the main stretches, but it wasn't until after the Second World War, I think, you eventually found you could get rid of the marmalade cart and the fella coming round. But there you are. Schools, I'm not going to go into schools, but we know schools grew from the very first one, 1659, which is now the Balti House. But that was built, then it fell down, then it was rebuilt. But the Formbys put a lot into this, and also the Our Lady's Church did a lot for this, and then the local churches all played their part in different schools. So there's a heck of a good story about that. And transport, the horse and cart, the most common way of travelling locally, as you can imagine. But there you are, eventually you got that place, and that's Chapel Lane, looked at from what is today the War Memorial. And also, not only did you get that, you also got the bypass. Well, that's not quite the bypass. That is, that's George Weatherby of Asphodel Crescent Alfcar. But the bypass came in the 30s, was obviously needed. There were 16 right-hand bends going through Formby. It took an absolute age. There were two petrol pumps, but 16 right-angled bends going through the village. Big carts going through, and something had to be done. It was done in 1938. It was opened December 1938. And 2 more petrol stations opened. One, of course, was Woodward's, and another one was the one which, what do we call it, the one at the top of whatever. There was one of the bypass, which was Woodward's, and the other further down towards Southcourt on the left, that one, whatever it's called now. Are there any Formby links to national history? Well, there's the guy who died fighting for King Henry IV, buried in York's Minster. There was a fire and his effigy was moved to St Luke's, still down there. He didn't want to come up here, obviously, but that is Richard Formby, who died in 1403. The people of Formby supposedly made a declaration of support for good Queen Bess against the King of Spain in 1585 on Cross Green. And there was rejoicing after the Armada. And there's a tradition that troops embarked at Formby to help fight the Jacobite rebellion in 1715. It would have been, yes, it would have been 1715 one. And of course, we've got the world's first lifeboat station, and don't let anybody from the northeast tell you it isn't. I'll tell you it is, because I asked Red York and he told me. And it is absolutely, and one of the best pieces of historical deduction. We've got that. It's a world record. I'm delighted. And the other thing I have to say was St Peter's Church. Doing this today, starting off, looking at the history of Formby at different times, is St Peter's Church playing its part. It's a beautiful church. It's unusual too because it was built in the 18th century, so the architecture is different. It's just such an important place. And I'm finished now, but I just wanted to say that you go outside and you see names. You're doing the voices from the graveyard, and I just had a look at one or two of them going through, and you could see the names of people there who'd died whilst a soldier in World War I, but they were already over here because they'd been repatriated to go to a military hospital, or they were working here as part of their army service, and they're in their memories of part of the history of Formby. And I just looked at one name which struck me. I'd come across it a few times, called Reem, and this particular one was where is he now? Oh no, I haven't lost him. Yeah, I mentioned Lovelady, a guy who worked as in the Royal Army Veterinary Corps, and he lived in Willow Grove, and he's there. He died in December 1918. He's out there. But also there's a Herbert Leopold Reem who died aged 18. He was born up in the Lake District. And what I didn't realise at first was he was a twin, and so therefore he died and his twin lived on many, many years. But Herbert Reem is buried here. And there's so many links to Formby in one way or another here. So I just wanted to finish off by saying this is a good place to be able to remember the history of Formby. And Joan. Do you want to just tell? And you can say that. Obviously, the Civic Society got hold of it's got the rights to Viking Village, but a friend of Joan's has asked, would it be possible to put on a podcast? And we were delighted to be able to say, of course, don't even think about it and do it. Sorry, you'd be able to do that. So Viking Village, you can't get, unless you're very lucky, you can't get in the bookshop. You can't get it online unless you're very lucky, but you can get a podcast. And where would you get it? Where would you find that? There you are. Podcast Viking Village. And is that a podcast? Whoa, okay, fine. Right, that's it. I'm sorry it's taken so long. Well, we're finished. We've arrived. I don't know.
What I'm going to do is say thank you very much, John, for really launching our Heritage Week, which is the second of the events for our 275th anniversary. I'm not letting him away, so I think if you've got questions, it's hard to hear everybody, so if you've got questions, come and have a chat with them. Please do take the time. We're open all week. The next of our actual talks is tomorrow evening. It's Sally Sheard, who's a parishioner here, who will speak on From Cradle to Grave, Formby Health Histories. And Sally is an expert in medical history, so that should be a very interesting evening. But do please stick around, look at the pictures. There is coffee over in our little coffee shop. There is merchandise, which Nick will sit behind. All the events are free, in theory, but if you would like to give a donation, we won't mind if you want to do that. That's okay with us. But John, thank you very much. And if you do have any questions, please come up and have a chat with them.
Small